Chosen one, something almost happened to you that was never supposed to fail. They spent weeks putting it together, maybe longer. Quiet conversations behind closed doors, careful timing. A story rehearsed so many times it started to sound true even to the people telling it. And the one person who agreed to hand them the final piece, the detail that was supposed to guarantee you never saw it coming, was your ex. Let that sit exactly where it lands. The same person who once knew your fears before you said them out loud, who knew which words would cut deepest and which silences would hurt the most, walked into a room full of people who wanted you gone and handed them the blueprint. They thought that was the end of it. They genuinely believed a trap built from your own history couldn't miss. And yet here you are, untouched, unshaken, still standing exactly where you were before any of them ever opened their mouths. No damage, no scars from a fight you never even had to fight. Just you, exactly as whole as you were, the day before they started planning any of it. That's not luck, chosen one. Luck doesn't casually survive a trap built with inside information, built by people who thought they knew exactly where you'd break. What saved you wasn't chance. It was something bigger, watching the whole operation unfold, long before it ever reached your doorstep. While they were congratulating themselves in private, confident that this time you wouldn't walk away clean, something was already working quietly against them, rearranging the outcome before the trap ever had the chance to close around you. You didn't know about most of it while it was happening. That's the part that hits different once you understand the full shape of it. You weren't in a defensive posture in that room because you didn't know a war had already been fought on your behalf before you even arrived. You were just living your life while somewhere behind closed doors, people were carefully deciding your ending for you. And they got it wrong. Not because you fought back in real time, not because you found out early and prepared some clever counterattack. They got it wrong the old-fashioned way, the way that humbles people the hardest. They underestimated exactly how untouchable you had already become. Think about what that actually means for a second, because it's easy to skip past it too quickly. A trap that fails quietly is one thing. A trap that fails in front of an audience, in front of the exact people it was built to impress, is something else entirely. That's not a private disappointment they get to process alone and move past on their own terms. That's a public unraveling, witnessed, remembered, and quietly retold by everyone who was standing in that room when it happened. They don't get to control that story the way they controlled the one they tried to tell about you. It's already out of their hands. Here's what's eating them alive right now, tonight, in whatever quiet corner they're sitting in. They didn't just fail. They failed in front of the very person they recruited to guarantee they wouldn't. Your ex staked something on this. Reputation, loyalty, whatever fragment of pride was left after everything that happened between you. And when the trap fell apart in front of witnesses, it didn't just expose the people who built it. It exposed the person who helped hand them the keys to build it. Imagine sitting in that aftermath, knowing you handed over the one advantage you swore would work, and watching it do nothing. Worse than nothing, watching it turn around and make everyone in that room look smaller than they've ever looked in their entire lives. Before we go further, if this is already landing somewhere real in you, hit like and subscribe. Not because a video needs numbers to survive, but because this message needs to reach the next chosen one, sitting exactly where you were a few weeks ago, wondering why the walls felt like they were closing in around them for reasons they couldn't fully name. Your support is what keeps this reaching them in time, before their own version of this story finishes writing itself. Now let's talk about what actually happened behind your back, because you deserve to see the whole picture, not just the ending you were handed after the fact. This didn't start on the day the trap was finally set. It started long before that, in small conversations you were never invited into. In moments where your name got passed around, like something to be handled, instead of someone to be respected. They watched you stay calm when things got hard. They watched you keep your dignity when it would have been so much easier to lash out, to defend yourself loudly, to give them the ammunition they were quietly hoping for. And instead of respecting that composure, they read it as an opening. They mistook your steadiness for unpreparedness. They mistook your silence for a complete absence of allies, of protection, of anything standing between you and whatever they were planning. That misread, that single arrogant assumption, is the entire reason this story is turning out the way it's turning out right now. Chosen one, if you can feel this building in your chest already, drop a 77 in the comments right now. Not for luck, as a marker, a signal that says you're still here, you're still calm, and you're ready to hear exactly how deep this goes. And if this message is doing something for you tonight, the super thanks button helps keep messages like this reaching the people who need them most. The ones sitting in a room right now, not yet realizing they were never as alone in it as they felt. Let's go step by step through what really happened. Because once you see the full shape of it laid out clearly, you're never going to underestimate your own protection again. Number 1, they needed a weak spot, so they went straight to the one person who used to hold your heart. Every trap needs an entry point. Every plan built to take someone down needs a crack to work through. Something soft, something familiar, something the target won't see coming because it's wrapped in a face they used to trust completely. That's exactly what they were looking for when they went hunting for your ex. Not because your ex was powerful, not because your ex had some special leverage over your life or your career or your name, but because your ex had history, and history in the wrong hands stops looking like memory and starts functioning like a blade pointed at your softest places. They sat down with your ex and asked the only question that actually mattered to them. What breaks them? What do they still flinch at, even years later? What's the one thing they never fully healed from that we can use? And your ex, whatever mix of bitterness or boredom or quiet resentment got them there, answered. Here's what they didn't calculate, and it's the mistake that undid the entire plan before it even left the drawing board. People change. The version of you your ex remembers, the one who might have folded under a certain kind of pressure 2 or 3 years ago, that version has been through things since then that your ex was never present for. That version has rebuilt itself quietly, privately, without applause, into someone who doesn't crumble the way an old memory suggests they should. Your ex handed them an outdated map and called it current intelligence. They built an entire operation around directions that no longer led anywhere near who you actually are. Imagine spending weeks constructing a key for a lock that was quietly changed months ago without anyone announcing it. That's what this was. All that planning, all that whispering behind closed doors, all that confidence walking into the room, aimed at a version of you that simply doesn't exist anymore. They thought they were setting a trap for the person you used to be. They ended up setting an elaborate trap for a memory. And memories don't flinch when someone tries to trigger them. They just sit there, harmless, while the real you walks straight through the middle of it, completely unaware there was ever supposed to be a fall waiting on the other side. And here's the quiet irony sitting underneath all of it. Your ex probably still believes they know you. That's often the most dangerous kind of certainty a person can carry. The kind built on a version of someone frozen at the exact moment things ended. People rarely go back and update that picture once it's been set. They keep carrying the old version around like it's still accurate, using it to make decisions, using it to answer questions about you they were never actually equipped to answer anymore. That's not malice necessarily. Sometimes it's just laziness dressed up as familiarity. But laziness like that, handed to the wrong people at the wrong moment, becomes exactly the kind of outdated weapon that misfires the second it's actually used. Number 2, The trap was never about you being wrong. It was about making you disappear quietly. Let's be honest about what this actually was, because the label matters more than people want to admit. This wasn't a disagreement that spiraled out of control. This wasn't a misunderstanding that grew teeth on its own. This was a coordinated attempt to remove you from a picture where you had quietly become inconvenient. Somewhere along the way, your steadiness started making certain people uncomfortable. Your refusal to react the way they expected started making them feel like they'd lost control of a script they thought they were still writing. And when people lose control of a narrative, the ones without real power don't confront you directly. They go around you instead. They build a version of events designed to make your exit look natural, deserved, even necessary, so that no one has to admit it was actually orchestrated from the start. That's the part that should settle in slowly, chosen one, not because you're in danger now, but because it shows you exactly what you were quietly navigating this whole time while you thought things were simply tense. This wasn't spontaneous. This was engineered with intention. Someone sat down and thought through timing, thought through who needed to hear what, and in what specific order, thought through how to make the ending look inevitable instead of manufactured by hands you never even suspected. Imagine builders constructing scaffolding around a building they intend to bring down, wrapping it carefully so no one on the street below realizes the demolition is already quietly underway. That's what this was. And the only reason it didn't work is because the building they were trying to bring down had a foundation they never actually bothered to study up close. They studied your history like it was a fixed document. They never studied your growth, because growth doesn't show up in old messages or old rumors or old stories your ex could hand over. That gap between what they researched and who you actually became is the entire reason you're still standing exactly where they wanted to erase you from. Ask yourself what it actually takes to plan something like that. It takes time, coordination, a willingness to sit in meetings talking about how to quietly dismantle someone's place in a room without ever saying it that plainly out loud. That's not something people do casually. That's something people do when they've decided you've become a problem worth solving through removal instead of conversation. Understanding that clearly matters because it tells you exactly how much energy they were willing to spend trying to make you smaller, and exactly how little of that energy actually reached you in the end. Number 3, your ex thought loyalty to them would erase what they once knew about you. This is the part that probably stings the most, and it should, because pretending it doesn't would be dishonest to you and to this story. Someone who once chose you, who once said they knew you better than anyone else on earth, decided that whatever they were being offered in that moment, attention, relevance, a seat at a table that suddenly mattered to them, was worth more than whatever version of loyalty they used to whisper to you in quieter, softer, more honest moments. That's real. That happened. And no reframing exercise is going to make that stop stinging entirely. But here's what your ex miscalculated in the middle of making that choice. Knowing someone once doesn't mean owning who they are now. Your ex knew a version of your fears frozen in time. They didn't know the version of you that faced those exact fears down alone, in rooms nobody else was ever invited into, and came out the other side calmer instead of smaller, steadier instead of shaken. They handed over information like it was still current currency, like the emotional map they memorized years ago hadn't been quietly redrawn 100 times since the two of you last spoke honestly. Imagine trying to navigate a city using directions from a decade ago, confident because you used to live there, not realizing entire streets have been rebuilt and old landmarks torn down. Your ex walked into that room with old directions and presented them like fresh intelligence. And when none of it worked the way they promised it would, they didn't just fail the people they were trying to impress. They quietly proved, to everyone watching in that room, that they never actually understood you as deeply as they used to claim. That gap between what they promised and what they actually delivered isn't your problem to carry anymore. That's entirely theirs to sit with, alone, on the nights it comes back around. Number 4. The room was set, the story was rehearsed, and then you simply didn't break. Picture it the way it was originally designed to unfold. A room, a specific moment, a story built precisely to provoke a reaction big enough to be used against you afterward. Maybe it was meant to make you defensive in a way that looked guilty. Maybe it was meant to make you emotional in front of people who'd later describe you as unstable or unreliable. Whatever the intended reaction was, they needed one badly. Traps like this simply don't work on stillness. They only work on eruption. They needed you to give them something loud enough to point at later and say, "See, this is exactly who they really are underneath it all." And you didn't give it to them, not because you knew what was coming and had rehearsed a comeback in advance. You didn't give it to them because somewhere along your own private journey, you stopped needing to win arguments in real time to know your own worth. You've already survived worse rooms than that one. You've already sat through harder silences than the one they were counting on breaking you. So when the moment finally came, when the story landed and every set of eyes turned toward you, waiting for the crack to appear, there wasn't one. There was just you, steady, unreadable, present in a way that gave them nothing to work with. Imagine a group of people pulling back a bowstring for weeks, aiming carefully, adjusting for wind and distance, only to release the arrow into open air because the target had already quietly moved somewhere they could no longer reach. That's what your stillness did in that room. It didn't dodge the attack in some dramatic way. It made the entire attack irrelevant before it even landed. And there is nothing more humiliating for people who planned an ambush than realizing, in real time, in front of witnesses whose respect they were trying to earn, that the person they were aiming at simply wasn't standing where they expected anymore. Ask yourself honestly for a second why that particular stillness felt so unfamiliar to them. It's because most people, when cornered, do exactly what's expected of them. They panic a little. They over-explain. They reach for justification even when none is needed, simply because silence in a tense room feels unbearable to sit inside of. You didn't reach for any of that, and the absence of that familiar scramble is precisely what told everyone paying attention that something about you had changed in ways they hadn't accounted for. You weren't performing composure that day. You had simply already arrived at it long before you ever walked through that door. Number 5. The moment they realized the trap had nothing left to catch. There's always a specific second in stories like this, a second where the confidence on their faces starts to slip just slightly, where the script they memorized suddenly feels flimsy in their own mouths as they're saying it out loud. That second happened. Maybe you saw it clearly. Maybe you were too calm in that moment to even register it happening in real time. But it happened, and everyone else in that room saw it too, whether they admitted it later or not. The story they told needed your reaction to feel complete. Without your reaction, it was just a story with a missing ending, sitting there awkwardly, unfinished, exposed for exactly what it always was underneath the performance. Imagine actors rehearsing a scene for weeks, memorizing every line, timing every beat down to the second, only to walk onto the stage and realize their scene partner never showed up at all. That's the silence they were suddenly standing inside of. They had prepared extensively for your anger, your tears, your defense, your desperate explanation. They hadn't prepared for nothing, and nothing is the one response no manipulation script ever properly accounts for, because nothing gives them absolutely no material left to twist and work with afterward. You didn't confirm their story with a reaction. You didn't dramatically deny it either. You simply existed in that room without performing the role they desperately needed you to perform, and that alone quietly dismantled the entire structure they spent so long building. This is the part they will never say out loud to anyone, including themselves late at night. The trap didn't fail because you got lucky. It failed because you refused to become the person they needed you to be in that exact moment. And there was no plan B written anywhere for that outcome. Number 6. Why your calm walked out of that room louder than anything they planned to say. You've probably noticed this pattern before in smaller moments throughout your life, but it's worth naming clearly here. Calm, real calm, the kind that isn't performed or forced or held together by sheer willpower, unsettles people who are used to controlling a room entirely through noise and volume. They walked in with a plan built on story, on emotional weight, on the assumption that this would tip the scale hard in their favor. What they didn't account for was a version of you that had already done the quiet, unglamorous work of not needing that particular room's approval to know exactly who you are. Think about what that actually communicates without a single word being spoken out loud. It says their story doesn't hold power over you anymore, and maybe it never fully did. It says you've already survived worse conclusions than the one they were desperately trying to write for you that day. It says whatever they thought they knew about your breaking point, they were simply wrong, outdated, working off old information nobody bothered to update. That kind of stillness doesn't read as guilt to the people paying close attention in the room. It reads as someone who has already made peace with themselves long before this particular ambush ever arrived on the calendar. Imagine walking into a storm expecting thunder, bracing for it, and instead finding still air, clear skies overhead, nothing left to fight against, no matter how hard you brace. That confuses people far more than resistance ever could, because resistance at least gives them something concrete to push against and justify their next move. Stillness gives them absolutely nothing to work with, and in the total absence of something to fight, all that energy they walked in with has nowhere left to go except quietly back onto themselves. That's worth remembering the next time you feel pressure building in a room that wants a reaction out of you. You don't owe anyone your composure as a performance, but you also don't owe anyone the reaction they came looking for. Staying grounded isn't about suppressing what you feel. It's about not handing your response over to people who were only ever going to use it against you anyway. Number 7. The silence after the ambush that no one saw coming. There's a particular kind of quiet that settles heavily over a room once a plan has visibly, undeniably failed in front of the exact people it was built to impress. Nobody wants to be the one to say it out loud first. Nobody wants to be the first person to admit the story simply didn't land the way it was promised it would. So instead, everyone just sits there in this strange, heavy pause, quietly recalculating, trying to figure out how to exit gracefully from a moment that clearly isn't going to end the way anyone in that room originally scripted. That silence, chosen one, that belongs to you now. Not because you demanded it or fought loudly to claim it. Not because you performed some grand gesture to earn it. You earned it the same way you earn most of the things worth having in life, by simply refusing to give people what they came looking for. Imagine a crowd gathering to watch a scheduled demolition, cameras ready, countdown timer running down toward 0, and then the building simply doesn't fall when the moment arrives. No explosion, no dramatic collapse. Just a building standing exactly where it always stood, while a crowd slowly, awkwardly, realizes the show they came for isn't happening after all. That confusion, that uncomfortable shuffling, the glances people exchange without quite knowing what to say next. That's what happened in that room. And here's the part that should sit with you the longest tonight. Silence like that doesn't fade quickly from a room. People remember it. They remember the exact moment the story fell apart in real time in front of them. And that memory follows the people who built the trap far longer, far more heavily than it will ever follow you. There's a reason silence lands harder than accusation ever could in a moment like that. Accusation gives people something to argue with, something to deny, something to spin into a counter-narrative later. Silence gives them nothing to work with at all. It just sits there in the room, unanswerable, undeniable, doing more damage to their credibility than any statement you could have made ever would have. You didn't need to win the argument that day, chosen one, because there was no argument left standing to win. There was only a room full of people quietly recalculating everything they thought they knew. Number 8. What your ex forgot when they picked a side. There's a version of loyalty that only exists when it's convenient, and there's a version that actually survives real pressure. Your ex chose to test which version they actually believed in, and the answer wasn't flattering to them at all. But before you let that answer define anything about your own worth, understand clearly what it actually reveals about them instead. It reveals that your ex was never operating from a place of genuine confidence in what they were doing. People who are truly certain about a decision don't need to recruit outside help just to make it land convincingly. They needed your ex, specifically because they knew, somewhere underneath all their outward confidence, that the story simply wouldn't hold up without an insider vouching quietly for its accuracy. That need, that quiet desperation to borrow credibility from someone who used to know you intimately, that isn't strength. That's a confession dressed up as strategy, a tell they didn't realize they were giving away. Imagine needing someone else's old key just to prove a lock still fits, because your own attempts kept failing quietly behind the scenes no matter how many times you tried. Your ex became that borrowed key, and when the lock still refused to turn, it wasn't just their plan that failed publicly. It was proof, laid out in front of everyone watching, that the person they trusted to open that door didn't actually understand what was standing behind it anymore. Whatever your ex forgot about who you've become in the process of choosing a side that day, they're going to remember it now, slowly, in the exact moment it stopped working entirely in their favor and started working quietly against them instead. Number 9. The receipts nobody expected you to have. Here's something worth sitting with for a moment. You didn't need to defend yourself with proof in that room, because your calm did the defending for you long before anyone reached for evidence. But that doesn't mean proof didn't exist somewhere in the background the whole time. Somewhere, quietly, without you ever forcing the issue or chasing it down yourself, the truth had already been documented by people who simply refused to bend it. Conversations remembered accurately by people who weren't willing to lie for anyone, no matter how much pressure they were under. Timelines that didn't match the version being sold to the room. Small inconsistencies that fall apart the second someone actually bothers to check them instead of simply repeating them because they sound convincing. They built their entire plan assuming no one would ever bother to verify any of it carefully, because most people genuinely don't. Most people accept the loudest version of a story, presented confidently, and simply move on with their day. What they didn't count on was landing in front of people who actually paid close attention, who noticed the gaps quietly, who remembered exactly what was said last month versus what was suddenly being said now with a completely different spin. Imagine building an entire case on a foundation you never once bothered to inspect closely, confident it would hold, simply because no one had questioned it out loud yet. Then imagine the very first real inspection happening in public, live, in front of an audience you never chose or prepared for. That's exactly what happened here. You didn't have to bring a single document into that room yourself. The truth had already been quietly gathering itself long before you ever needed it, patiently waiting for the exact moment they finally decided to test it in front of witnesses. That's the quiet lesson worth carrying forward from all of this, chosen one. You don't need to walk around collecting evidence against people out of fear or suspicion. That's not what kept you safe here, and it's not a habit worth building out of this experience. What kept you safe was living honestly enough, consistently enough, that the truth simply existed on its own, ready whenever it was actually needed. That's a far lighter way to move through the world than carrying constant proof around like armor. Integrity does the collecting for you, quietly, without you ever having to think about it. Number 10. Why the same people who clapped for the plan are now avoiding your name. This is the part that almost always happens after a plan like this collapses publicly, and it's worth understanding clearly, because it will help you make complete sense of what's coming next in the weeks ahead. The people who nodded along enthusiastically, who agreed the plan, sounded solid and airtight, who maybe even added a small detail or two of their own to help strengthen the story, they're not staying loyal to the people who built this trap. They're distancing themselves as fast as they possibly can, because now that the story fell apart in public, standing too close to it means standing too close to the fallout that's about to follow. You'll notice it in small ways first, the way these things always announce themselves quietly before anyone says anything directly. Messages that used to come regularly slow down, then stop entirely. Eye contact that used to be easy and casual now feels careful, measured, deliberately avoided. Conversations that used to include your name casually now avoid it entirely. Like saying it out loud might drag them back into a mess they'd genuinely rather forget they were ever a willing part of. Imagine a crowd gathered eagerly around someone who confidently promised rain for weeks, cheering every prediction, adjusting their plans around it. Then, the sky simply stays clear day after day. Slowly, quietly, that crowd disperses on their own, each person pretending they were never really that invested in the forecast to begin with, that they always had their doubts. That's exactly what's happening around the people who built this trap right now, in real time. Nobody wants to be remembered as the person who believed loudly in a plan that fell apart publicly in front of everyone. So they're rewriting their own involvement quietly, hoping the rewrite sticks before anyone thinks to ask too many uncomfortable questions. You don't need to chase down every person who quietly stepped back and demand an explanation. Let them go. People who only stand beside you when it's easy were never actually standing with you to begin with. They were simply standing near you while it was convenient. Their absence now isn't a loss, it's clarity, delivered a little later than you might have wanted, but delivered honestly all the same. The people worth keeping close are the ones who didn't need a public collapse to figure out which side of this they were always going to be on. Number 11. The shame that doesn't leave when the lights go off. Public failure is one thing, and people genuinely do recover from public failure all the time, given enough distance and enough time. What doesn't fade nearly as easily is the private shame that shows up later, alone, in the quiet hours, when there's no audience left in the room to perform confidence for anymore. That's the version of consequence they're sitting with right now, tonight. And it's a much heavier weight than anything you could have said to them directly in that room. Because here's what shame like that actually sounds like in the quiet hours when no one else is listening. It sounds like replaying the exact moment the room went silent and realizing there's no version of that memory that doesn't make them look small. It sounds like remembering precisely how confident they felt walking in that day and comparing it over and over to how hollow they felt walking out. It sounds like knowing, deep down where they can't quite outrun it, that the person they tried to take down didn't even need to fight back to win, and somehow that makes the loss feel even heavier than if you had fought back loudly. Imagine carrying a wound that nobody else around you can even see, one that quietly reopens every time your name gets mentioned in passing, every time someone brings up that meeting casually. every time silence in an unrelated room reminds them of the exact silence that broke their entire plan apart. That's not a punishment you personally handed them, Chosen One. That's simply the natural weight of building something dishonest and then watching it collapse in front of witnesses who won't forget it. Shame like that doesn't need your help to stay heavy. It carries its own gravity, and it will keep carrying it long after this particular story stops being talked about out loud. Number 12. Why your ex is the one drowning now, not you. Let's return to your ex directly for a moment, because this part matters and deserves to be said plainly. Whatever they thought they were gaining by getting involved in this, relevance, closeness to a group that suddenly made them feel important again, some quiet satisfaction in believing they finally had leverage over you after everything, none of it landed the way they imagined it would when they agreed to it. Instead, they're left holding something far heavier than they expected. The knowledge that they chose to hurt someone who never once gave them a reason to, based on information that stopped being true a long time before they ever offered it up. That's not a light thing to carry, even for someone who convinces themselves out loud that they don't care anymore. Somewhere, in a quiet, unguarded moment, that decision is going to sit with them differently than they expected it to when they made it so confidently. Not because you're going to remind them of it directly, not because anyone else is going to bring it up constantly in conversation, but because decisions like that have a strange way of resurfacing entirely on their own, usually at the exact moments people least want to be thinking about them. Imagine handing someone a weapon you were absolutely certain still worked perfectly, watching them try to use it in front of an audience, and realizing in real time that the thing you handed them was already broken long before that day, and that everyone in the room now knows you're the one who handed it over anyway. That recognition doesn't fade quickly from memory. Your ex isn't drowning right now because you pushed them under the surface. They're drowning because they stepped willingly into water they never fully understood the depth of, and you were never the one who put them there to begin with. None of this needs to turn into ongoing bitterness on your end either, Chosen One, and that's worth saying plainly. You don't have to spend energy wishing them worse things or checking in on how badly it's going for them. Let their own choices carry their own weight. You have somewhere to be, a life to keep building, growth to keep quietly accumulating. Their drowning was never something you needed to orchestrate or even witness closely. It's simply the natural result of the decision they made, playing out exactly the way decisions like that tend to play out once enough time has passed. Number 13. The universe's timing that protected you before you even knew there was danger. Here's the part that should genuinely settle something quiet in you tonight, Chosen One. You weren't aware of most of this while it was actually happening behind the scenes. You weren't strategizing some elaborate defense in advance. You weren't bracing yourself for an ambush you couldn't see coming. You were simply living, staying grounded in your own life, continuing to grow in ways nobody in that room was paying close enough attention to notice or account for. And that ordinary, unremarkable, unglamorous consistency turned out to be the exact thing that made their entire plan impossible to execute the way they designed it. Timing like that doesn't happen entirely by accident, no matter how it looks from the outside. There's something almost poetic about the fact that the version of you they needed to catch off guard simply didn't exist anymore by the time they were finally ready to spring the trap they'd spent so long building. Imagine a hunter tracking prey carefully for weeks, finally arriving at the exact clearing where the trap was set, only to find the ground has quietly shifted, the paths have changed direction, and the animal they were tracking has already grown too aware, too steady, too far ahead to be caught the way it once could have been caught easily. You didn't outrun them because you somehow knew they were coming for you. You simply kept becoming someone harder to catch, one quiet, ordinary day at a time, without ever needing an audience to witness that private growth happening. And when the moment finally arrived that was supposed to end your story, it arrived too late for the version of you they were fully prepared for. That's not luck, chosen one. That's what protection actually looks like when it works quietly, in advance, long before you ever knew you needed it. Think back over the small things that used to confuse you before you understood the shape of what was happening. The conversation that got postponed for no clear reason and later turned out to matter enormously. The instinct that told you to keep your circle small during exactly the window when this was being planned. The quiet pull to spend more time building yourself up instead of proving anything to anyone watching. None of that was random either. Growth doesn't usually announce itself with fireworks. Most of the time, it just shows up as a series of small, unremarkable choices that quietly stack into something unbreakable by the time anyone tries to test it. Number 14. Why every attempt they made afterward only made their exposure louder. Here's something worth understanding about people who fail publicly the way they did. Their first instinct almost never involves accepting what happened and moving forward quietly. Their first instinct is damage control, and damage control executed in a panic almost always makes things worse instead of better. In the days after that room went silent on them, watch how the story kept shifting. Watch how small details started changing depending on who they were talking to that day. That kind of inconsistency is exactly what happens when people are scrambling to rebuild a version of events that already collapsed once in front of witnesses. Every new version they tell adds one more thread that doesn't match the last one. Every attempt to smooth it over creates one more small contradiction for someone paying attention to notice and quietly file away. Imagine trying to patch a cracked wall with mismatched paint under bright daylight, convinced nobody will notice the seams, while everyone standing in the room can clearly see exactly where the new patch begins and the old wall ends. That's what their cleanup attempts look like right now, to anyone who was actually present that day. You don't need to correct any of it yourself. You don't need to point out the inconsistencies publicly or keep score out loud. The story is already doing that work on its own, quietly, one shifting version at a time, while you simply continue living the life they tried and failed to interrupt. Number 15. Why the people who orchestrated this can't rebuild trust with anyone who was actually in that room. Trust is a strange thing to try and repair once it's been publicly spent on a plan that failed in front of witnesses. The people who organized this didn't just lose an attempt at taking you down. They lost something much harder to earn back: the quiet confidence of everyone who watched them promise a specific outcome and then fail to deliver it. Think about what that means for them moving forward. The next time they walk into a room with a plan, with a story, with a confident claim about what's about to happen, the people who were there that day are going to remember. They're going to remember the certainty in their voice right before it all fell apart. And that memory is going to sit quietly underneath every future conversation, whether anyone says it out loud or not. That's a heavier cost than most people realize when they set out to build a trap like this. It's not just that the plan failed once. It's that failure has a way of following the architect long after the moment itself is over. Imagine a contractor who promises a building will hold, watches it buckle in front of the client, and then tries to get hired again the following month. Even if nobody says it directly, everyone in that meeting is thinking about the last time. That's exactly the position they're in now. Every future plan, every future claim, every future attempt to rally people around a story, it's all going to carry the quiet shadow of the time it didn't work. The time everyone watched it not work. The time the target simply stood there and let the whole thing collapse on its own. You don't have to do anything to maintain that shadow. You don't have to bring it up in conversation or remind anyone what happened. Reputations like that maintain themselves. People remember exactly who promised them a result and then failed to produce one, especially when the failure happened in such a quiet, undramatic, undeniable way. That's not something you're doing to them anymore, chosen one. That's simply the natural consequence of building something that couldn't hold weight the first time it was tested in public. Number 16. The quiet respect you're getting now from people who used to stay carefully neutral. Here's something worth noticing in the weeks since all of this unfolded. Some of the people who used to stay quiet, who used to sit somewhere in the middle without ever fully picking a side, they're behaving differently around you now. Not loudly, not with big public gestures or dramatic apologies, just small shifts you might have already noticed if you've been paying attention. A slightly warmer greeting, a conversation that lasts a little longer than it used to, someone checking in on you for no particular reason, just to see how you're doing. That's not random, and it's not simply people trying to get back in your good graces after staying quiet during the hard part. That's people quietly recalibrating their entire read of you after watching how you handled a moment that was designed to break you completely. People notice composure more than they ever say out loud. They notice who stays grounded when the room is stacked against them, and they file that information away even when they don't comment on it in the moment itself. Imagine watching two people go through the exact same storm, one falling apart completely under the pressure, and one staying remarkably steady through the entire thing. You don't need anyone to explain to you afterward which one earned quiet respect and which one didn't. It's simply visible in how each person carried themselves once the storm passed. That's what's happening around you right now, chosen one, in small, quiet ways you might not have fully clocked yet. The people who stayed neutral watched closely, and what they saw has changed how they see you, whether they've said it directly or not. You don't need to chase that respect down or thank anyone for finally noticing. It arrived on its own, the way most real respect does, quietly, after enough time has passed for people to be certain what they witnessed wasn't a temporary performance. Let it come at its own pace. You were never doing any of this to be noticed in the first place, and that's precisely why the version of respect you're receiving now feels different, steadier, more honest than anything performed applause could have given you in the moment itself. Number 17. This was never a war you needed to win. You just had to survive it standing still. Here's where this settles, chosen one, calmly, without drama, because that's exactly how this story was always supposed to end. You didn't need a comeback speech prepared in advance. You didn't need to expose anyone publicly or demand a formal apology from your ex or from the people who followed their plan into that room. You didn't need any of that, because the trap collapsing on its own in front of witnesses who won't forget it already said everything that ever needed saying on your behalf. Sometimes the most complete victory looks like nothing happening at all. No explosion, no dramatic confrontation, just a plan that quietly failed and a person who kept walking forward without ever needing to acknowledge out loud that it even happened. That's the version of strength most people never quite learn how to hold, because most people confuse winning with reacting loudly in the moment. You didn't react. You simply continued being exactly who you already were, and that turned out to be more than enough to end it. Imagine a fortress that was never designed to repel an attack loudly or dramatically, because it never needed defenses that theatrical in the first place. It simply stood, unmoved, while everything thrown at it lost momentum against walls that were already stronger than anyone standing outside them ever realized. That's what happened here. They spent weeks building something meant to end you, and it broke apart quietly against a version of you they never once bothered to actually get to know. You don't owe them a reaction now. You don't owe your ex an explanation either. You already gave the only response that ever mattered in a moment like that, and it was simply staying whole while everything around you tried to prove otherwise. And maybe that's the real lesson sitting underneath everything you just walked through, chosen one. Not that you outsmarted anyone, Not that you planned some brilliant counter-move behind the scenes. Just that you kept becoming yourself, quietly, consistently, on ordinary days nobody was watching, and that was enough on its own to survive something built specifically to end you. There's a strange kind of power in that, the power of not needing a single dramatic moment to prove your worth, because the proof was already accumulating in the background the entire time, one steady day after another, long before anyone ever tried to test it. So here's where we leave it tonight, chosen one, quiet and steady, exactly the way this always should have ended. What was carefully built to break you couldn't hold, because you had already quietly become someone it was never designed for in the first place. The room that was supposed to end your story instead became the room where everyone in it quietly learned, one more time, that they'd underestimated you completely. Your ex learned something too tonight, something they'll be sitting with far longer than they ever expected to when they agreed to help. And you simply get to walk forward exactly the way you already were before any of this started. Untouched, unshaken, whole. Exactly the way you were always going to end up, no matter what they tried to build against you. Before you go, a quick and honest note worth pausing on. Content like this is meant for reflection and encouragement, not as a replacement for real conversations with people you actually trust, and definitely not as a reason to cut off family, friends, or professional support in your life. If old wounds around trust or betrayal are sitting heavy on you tonight, talking honestly with someone you trust, a counselor, or a support line in your area can help in ways no video ever fully will. If this message reached something real in you tonight, hit like, subscribe, and drop a 77 in the comments one more time to let the next chosen one know this story is already waiting quietly for them too. Thanks for watching. We'll see you in the next one. Take care and goodbye.